The message arrived like a ghost, a three-word fragment, clawed from the static-choked heart of a storm that had, by all accounts, swallowed an entire mountain range. Forward Operating Base Peregrine, home to 34 souls from the 10th Mountain Division, had vanished from the grid. One moment they were reporting routine operations in the desolate Zagros Mountains. The next, they were gone. All satellites, all drones, all communication links showed nothing but a swirling, monstrous weather cell that had appeared out of nowhere. It was a meteorological black hole. Then, after 12 hours of absolute silence, the message came through to CENTCOM's listening post. It was a single, garbled transmission from a low-power radio, spoken with an unnerving calm. "Gods are stirring." The phrase baffled everyone. It wasn't a distress code. It wasn't a standard report. Intelligence analysts cross-referenced it against every known codebook, every insurgent lexicon, every psychological profile for troops under extreme isolation stress. They found nothing. It was dismissed by most as nonsense, the product of fear and hypoxia in the thin mountain air. But the storm itself was undeniably real. It was a monster, a freak of nature pulsing with unprecedented levels of electromagnetic energy. It was expanding, and nothing could get through it. At Bagram Airfield, the 77th Expeditionary Fighter Squadron, the Gamblers, were grounded. Their fleet of F-35s, the most advanced fighting machines ever built, were useless. Their sensitive, network-centric systems would be fried by the storm's output. In the tense briefing room, the pilots watched the satellite feed, a swirling vortex of deep purple, with a kind of morbid awe. Among them, sitting slightly apart, was Captain Kaylin Rios. Her call sign was Valkyrie. She flew an F-16C, tail number 870362, a plane most of the younger pilots considered a museum piece. They called it the Viper, a relic from a bygone era of analog gauges and hydraulic controls. To the F-35 jocks, with their helmet, displays and sensor fusion, Rios was as much a relic as her jet. She was quiet, competent, a veteran of campaigns that didn't appear in official records, a fact that had stalled her career in a state of perpetual captaincy. While the others saw a storm, Rios saw a presence. She traced its outline on her datapad, her expression unreadable. Commander Thorne, a man who flew a desk more than a jet, briefed them for the 10th time. "We wait," he said, his voice tight. "No one goes near that thing. It's a meat grinder." His eyes flicked to Rios, a hint of disdain in his gaze. He didn't trust her unnerving calm. He saw it as arrogance, a hallmark of a pilot with a reputation for pushing limits. He was right not to trust her. She wasn't watching the storm. She was listening to it. The second transmission came 22 hours after the first. It wasn't a whisper, it was a scream. The audio was clearer this time, a raw feed from a soldier's helmet cam, cutting through the static for a horrifying 30 seconds. First, there was a sound, a deep, resonant, and rhythmic thrumming that seemed to vibrate through the speakers and into the bones of everyone in the briefing room. It was followed by the sustained, desperate crackle of M4 carbines and the unmistakable sound of sheer, unadulterated panic. Men were shouting, screaming. Then, a single voice, sharp with terror, cut through the chaos. "They're not human, oh God, they're not human." They came out of the ground. A burst of static, a final choked-off scream, and then silence. The room was frozen. The phrase, "they came out of the ground," hung in the air, more terrifying than any distress call. Commander Thorne was the first to break the silence, his voice strained. "Auditory pareidolia, hypoxia, they're hallucinating." But no one was convinced. But terror in that voice had been real. The casual jokes about the ghosts of the Zagros died on their lips. The pilots exchanged uneasy glances. This was something new, something ancient and wrong. Kaylin Rios stood up. She walked to the front of the room, her datapad held out. "Commander, this isn't a storm," she said, her voice cutting through the tension. She pointed to the screen. "Look at the electrical discharge patterns. They're not chaotic. They're concentric, focused in a perfect ring around the FOB's last known coordinates. It's an energy field, not a weather front. And that thrumming sound, I've heard it before." Thorne scoffed, his authority threatened. "Heard it where, Captain?" "In some story you read." The other pilots shifted uncomfortably. "This is a meteorological event. Your F-16's avionics would be shredded. The F-35s can't handle it. We are grounded. That is a direct order." Rios didn't flinch. Her dark eyes met his. "My bird is different, sir. She's hardened. She's analog where it matters. He was built for things like this." A memory flickered behind her gaze, a sky filled with burning green light, a mission that was never logged. a call sign earned in a place where myths walked the earth. Valkyrie wasn't a nickname, it was a job description. She had been the one sent to ferry the worthy from a battlefield no one else could reach. She turned and walked towards the hangar bay, her decision made. "I'm going to prep my jet," she said, her voice leaving no room for argument. Thorn's face flushed with anger. "Captain Rios, you are on the verge of gross insubordination. I will have you grounded for life." Rios paused at the door, her back to him. "There are 34 men on that mountain, Commander. If we wait for this meteorological event to pass, there'll be nothing more than a ghost story." She walked out, leaving the stunned briefing room in her wake. The hangar was a cavern of shadows and silence, a stark contrast to the howling wind outside. Her F-16C, tail number 870362, sat waiting under the dim sodium lights. It was an old warrior, its grey paint bearing the scars of 100 battles. Its lines less sleek than the F-35's, but more brutally functional. On the canopy rail, just below her name, was a small, hand-painted symbol that most pilots overlooked, a winged shield, the insignia of a Valkyrie. Her crew chief, Master Sergeant Elias Vance, met her at the cockpit ladder. He was a grizzled veteran who had followed her from one forgotten posting to another, a man who knew her secrets. He didn't ask if she was going. He knew. "The EM interference is off the charts," Vance said, his voice a low rumble. "Nothing should be flying in this." Rios ran a gloved hand along the Viper's fuselage, a familiar, comforting gesture. "She's not nothing, Elias, you know that. How are the countermeasures?" "I stripped out the non-essentials," Vance replied, patting a panel near the engine intake. "Rerouted the surge protection to the primary flight controls and the HUD. It's a brute force fix. She won't be able to talk to anyone, and the GPS will be a ghost, but the stick and throttle should stay live." Maybe. This was the core of their bond, an unspoken trust forged in the crucible of impossible missions. Vance was the keeper of her jet's secrets. It wasn't a standard F-16. Over the years, it had been unofficially modified with hardened components and shielded systems from black projects, turning it into a ghost plane, perfectly suited for a ghost pilot. "The munitions?" Rios asked, as she settled into the cockpit. "Smart bombs will be useless. Way ahead of you," Vance said with a grim smile. "Swapped the JDAMs for old-school iron, cluster bombs, MK-82 slicks, and a full drum for the Vulcan. Whatever's in that storm, you'll need to see it to kill it." He handed her a heavily insulated data cartridge. "Last known coordinates of the FOB and a simple inertial navigation program. It's all you'll have once you're inside." The hangar doors rumbled open, revealing Commander Thorn and a squad of air police, their weapons held at a low ready. "Rios, I am ordering you to stand down. This is your final warning." Rios ignored him, her movements deliberate as she strapped herself in. She looked at Thorn, her gaze cutting through the gloom. "Did you hear the terror in that man's voice, Commander?" She sealed her canopy. The hiss of the seal was a final, defiant act. Vance pulled the ladder away, placing himself between the jet and the armed men. He looked at Thorn. "You can court-martial us both when she gets back, sir." The F-16's engine spooled up with a deafening roar that shook the hangar. Thorn could only watch, impotent, as the old Viper taxied into the raging storm, a lone warrior, answering a call no one else dared to hear. The storm hit the F-16 like a clenched fist. The jet shuddered violently, alarms blaring in a chaotic symphony of failure. Rios's head was thrown against the headrest, but her hands were like stone on the stick and throttle. Outside the canopy, the world dissolved into a churning, incandescent, violet tendrils of green lightning crawled across the polycarbonate like living things. The head-up display flickered, cascaded with error messages, and died with a shower of sparks. The radios went silent. The GPS vanished. She was blind, deaf, and utterly alone, flying a ghost ship into the heart of a maelstrom. The noise was a physical pressure, a high-frequency shriek that vibrated through the airframe and into her teeth. This was what Thorn had feared. An F-35, with its delicate networked brain, would have been instantly lobotomized. But the Viper was a different beast. Rios felt the jet struggle not through a computer interface, but through the raw mechanical feedback of cable and hydraulic fluid. She was flying by the seat of her pants, a skill that had become a lost art in the modern Air Force. She forced her breathing to slow, filtering out the chaos, letting her true training take over. It wasn't the standard Air Force curriculum. It was something older, taught to her by a mentor, long since gone, in a program that officially never existed. "Don't fight the storm, Kalen," his voice echoed in her memory. "Let it show you the way. Every current, Every pocket of dead air is a sign. The sky speaks. You just have to learn to listen. She stopped fighting the turbulence and began to read it. She eased the throttle, letting the jet ride the violent currents instead of battling them, like a surfer on a monstrous wave. Through a momentary break in the swirling chaos, she saw it. For a fraction of a second, the violet clouds parted, and she looked down. The ground itself was pulsing. Veins of a faint, sickly yellow light throbbed in rhythmic patterns across the landscape, all converging on a single point miles ahead, the location of Fob Peregrine, and the thrumming sound from the radio. It wasn't just a sound. She could feel it now, a low-frequency vibration that resonated through the airframe and into her very bones. The storm wasn't a weather pattern. It was a consequence. The thrumming was the cause. A profound sense of clarity cut through her fear. This was why she was here. This was why her jet was the way it is. Her whole life, her secret career, had been a preparation for this moment. The call sign Valkyrie wasn't just a name. It was a destiny. The men at FOB Peregrine were trapped on a battlefield that had slipped outside the known world, and she was their only hope. She pushed the throttle forward, diving deeper into the violet heart of the storm, no longer just a pilot, but a myth made real, flying an ancient beast into the mouth of hell. After an eternity of violent chaos, the F-16 punched through the inner wall of the storm cell and into a pocket of eerie calm. Rios found herself in a vast, circular cavern of cloud, a hurricane's eye, but this was no natural formation. The walls of the storm rotated in a perfect, mesmerizing vortex around her. Below, the ground was starkly visible. FOB Peregrine was there, a tiny collection of sand-colored prefabs and HESCO barriers. But it was under siege. The source of the pulsing yellow light was a network of massive, crystalline structures that had erupted from the ground. They looked like some kind of alien geology, and they thrummed with an internal energy, casting a jaundiced glow on the scene. And swarming around the base, moving with a fluid, insect-like speed, were figures. They were not human. They were tall, impossibly thin, with limbs that bent at unnatural angles. Their forms seemed to shift and distort, as if they were not entirely in phase with this reality. They carried no visible weapons, yet, as she watched, a section of the FOB's defensive wall simply dissolved, turning to dust as a group of the creatures gestured towards it. The soldiers of the 10th Mountain were putting up a heroic but futile fight. Muzzle flashes from their rifles looked like tiny, desperate sparks against the overwhelming strangeness of their foe. They were falling back towards the central command post, their numbers dwindling. Rios saw a cluster of them trying to drag a wounded comrade, their movements frantic. The creatures flowed around their defenses, ignoring bullets that seemed to pass right through them. They were not attacking the soldiers directly. They were dismantling the base, erasing their presence with an unnerving, methodical efficiency. Rios's blood ran cold. This was not combat. It was an extermination. There was no time for a plan. She rolled the Viper onto its side, the G-force pressing her into her seat, and dived. Her thumb flicked the master arm switch to on. The HUD was still dead, so she relied on the old iron sights, a simple reticle painted on the canopy glass. It was primitive, but it was reliable. She lined up a cluster of the crystalline structures that seemed to be the source of the energy. That her target was perilously close to the American positions. A single mistake would annihilate the very people she was here to save. She couldn't use the bombs yet, not without risking friendly fire. It had to be the cannon. She squeezed the trigger. The F-16's Vulcan cannon erupted with its iconic, terrifying brut. The jet shuddered as it unleashed a torrent of 20mm high explosive incendiary rounds. The stream of tracers, like a fiery spear, smashed into the crystalline growths. The effect was instantaneous and spectacular. The crystal didn't just shatter, it detonated in a flash of blinding yellow light, sending a shockwave that rippled through the air and shook Rios's jet. The creatures connected to it recoiled, their forms flickering violently. For the first time, they seemed to notice her, and as one, they all turned their featureless faces towards the sky. The creatures on the ground reacted with terrifying speed. They didn't fire weapons, they manipulated the air itself. A wave of shimmering distortion, like a supercharged heat haze, erupted from the ground and rushed towards her F-16. Rios felt it before she saw it, a sudden crushing pressure on the airframe, as if the sky were turning to solid glass. The controls became sluggish, heavy. The jet groaned in protest, its engines straining against an invisible force that sought to tear it apart. This wasn't a dogfight against another aircraft. She was fighting the environment itself. The creatures were warping the very physics of The space she occupied, she shoved the throttle to full afterburner, the engine screaming as it dumped raw fuel into the exhaust. The Viper, a testament to raw brute force power, trembled and clawed its way through the distorted air. The pressure eased, but Rios knew she couldn't fly straight and level. They would anticipate that she had to think in 3 dimensions, to use the vertical space they didn't seem to understand. She pulled back hard on the stick, sending the F-16 into a gut-wrenching vertical climb. The G-forces were immense, blurring her vision, but she fought through the grout, her focus absolute. She watched her altimeter spin wildly. 15,000 feet, 20,000 feet. She needed to get above them, to come at them from an angle they wouldn't expect. From the apex of her climb, she looked down. The battlefield was a hellish tableau of pulsing yellow light and desperate, flickering muzzle flashes. The creatures were regrouping, their attention now divided between the soldiers on the ground and the screaming metal bird that had just wounded them. Down at FOB Peregrine, the surviving soldiers stared in disbelief. Through the unnatural twilight, they had seen the Viper burst from the storm like an avenging angel. They had heard the roar of its cannon, a sound more beautiful than any hymn. For the first time in hours, they felt a flicker of hope. The relentless silent advance of the enemy had paused. The soldier who had made the radio call, a young sergeant named Diaz, looked up, shielding his eyes. "It's a Viper," he breathed, his voice filled with awe. A goddamn Viper. They didn't know who was flying it. They didn't care. All they knew was that they were no longer alone. Rios rolled the F-16 over at 25,000 feet, hanging upside down for a moment, a predator assessing its prey. She couldn't keep making cannon runs. It exposed her to their atmospheric attacks and used precious fuel. She needed to do decisive damage. She needed to take out the source. Her eyes fixed on the largest of the crystalline structures, a massive, pulsating monolith at the center of the network. It was the heart. She armed the Mk2's 500-pound unguided bombs, dumb bombs. In an age of smart weapons, they were relics. But in a place where technology fails, their brutal simplicity was their greatest strength. She took a deep breath, whispered a prayer to the god of pilots, and began her dive. The dive was steep, almost vertical. The wind screamed past the canopy, a rising crescendo of fury. Rios was completely focused. Her world narrowed to the glowing monolith and the iron sight on her canopy. There were no targeting computers, no laser guidance, no data links. There was only her, the jet, and the unyielding laws of physics. She had to calculate the release point in her head, factoring in her speed, her altitude, the wind, and the bomb's trajectory. It was a skill that belonged to a previous generation of pilots, a skill she had perfected in forgotten conflicts. The creatures below were not idle. They seemed to understand her intent. The air in her path began to shimmer again, but this time, it was different. Instead of a uniform pressure, pockets of intense distortion formed around her, like invisible mines in the sky. Her jet was buffered, thrown left and right, the airframe groaning under the strain. An alarm, one of the few systems still working, blared a stark, repetitive warning of imminent structural failure. She ignored it, her grip on the stick tightening, making tiny, precise adjustments, wrestling the 20-ton machine into submission. The G-forces pressed down, and for a split second, a memory surfaced. She was a young lieutenant. Her same man who taught her to listen to the sky was yelling at her in a simulator. "You're relying on the tech. The computer is a tool. Rio's not a crutch. What happens when it's gone? What happens when it's just you? Fly the plane, feel it, become a part of it." The memory gave her strength. She wasn't just a pilot in a machine. She and the Viper were one entity, a single weapon honed for this exact moment. Her thumb hovered over the pickle button on the control stick. The monolith grew in her vision, its sickly yellow light filling the cockpit. Her thrumming intensified, vibrating through her bones, a primal hum of alien power. Now she pressed the button. She felt the satisfying clunk as the 2 MKT-2s detached. From their pylons, the F-16, suddenly lighter, leaped upward. She pulled back on the stick with all her strength, firewalling the throttle, pushing the airframe to its absolute limit to escape the blast radius. The G-forces were crushing, her vision tunneling to a tiny point of light. She didn't see the impact, but she felt it. A colossal shockwave slammed into her jet, throwing it across the sky like a leaf in a gale. The cockpit was filled with a brilliant, searing white light that penetrated her closed eyelids. And then, silence. The thrumming, the constant, oppressive vibration that had permeated everything since she entered the storm. Stopped. The sudden, absolute quiet was more shocking than the explosion. As her vision cleared, she risked a glance over her shoulder. Where the monolith stood, there was now a crater of molten glass. The network of yellow veins across the landscape was dark. The creatures on the ground were motionless, their forms flickering and dissolving like smoke. She had cut the head off the snake. The silence was profound, broken only by the wind and the sputtering cough of her engine. The eerie pulsing glow was gone, replaced by the natural gloom of the storm. The F-16 limped through the air. Multiple warning lights, previously shorted out, flickered back to life, painting the cockpit in a chaotic tapestry of red and amber. The structural failure alarm was now a steady, ominous tone. Rios ran a quick systems check. The port horizontal stabilizer was barely responding, and the fuel gauge was dropping at an alarming rate. The blast wave had done more damage than she thought. Her radio crackled. A single, distorted word broke the silence. Valkyrie. It was Diaz. From the ground. The destruction of the monolith must have cleared some of the interference. Rios fumbled with her comms panel. FOB Peregrine. This is Valkyrie status. The reply was a chorus of cheers, a raw emotional outburst that cut through the static. They're gone. They just ... faded away. You did it. God in heaven, you did it. Diaz's voice came through again, strained, but clear. We have multiple wounded, but we're alive. Valkyrie ... Who are you? Rios looked down at the battered fob, at the small figures of soldiers emerging from their cover, looking up at her jet. Who was she? She was Captain Kalen Rios, a pilot whose career had been sidelined because she knew things she shouldn't, because she'd fought in wars that were never declared. She was a ghost in the system. But that's not what he was asking. He was asking what she was, just a pilot. She transmitted, her voice raspy. Glad I could help. I'm running on fumes. I have to find a way out of this storm. As if on cue, the storm itself began to change. The perfectly circular walls of the eye started to break apart. The unnatural structure was collapsing without the energy of the monolith to sustain it. The wind patterns were becoming chaotic, unpredictable again. The calm was over. She had a rapidly closing window to escape before the entire structure caved in on itself. Her fuel was critical. Her jet was crippled. She would never make it back to her home base. She scanned her limited navigation display, which was slowly coming back online. There was an old, abandoned auxiliary airstrip about 80 miles away, a relic of a past war. It was little more than a strip of asphalt in the middle of nowhere. It was her only chance. FOB Peregrine, she said, her voice steady despite the dire situation. I'm not going to make it back to base. I'm diverting to Sheol Pass. Tell the gamblers. Tell them I'm sorry for the mess. She banked the wounded F-16, turning its nose towards the coordinates of the forgotten runway, and flew back into the churning, collapsing walls of the storm. The soldiers below watched until the lone jet was swallowed by the clouds. A disappearing myth flying back through the storm was a different kind of hell. Before, it was an organized, albeit alien, system. Now, it was pure anarchy. The collapsing energy field had turned the atmosphere into a blender. Downdrafts grabbed the F-16 and slammed it downwards thousands of feet at a time, only for a violent updraft to catch it and throw it back up. The jet creaked and groaned, the sound of stressed metal, a constant, terrifying companion. Rios was no longer flying. She was merely surviving, making hundreds of micro-corrections a second just to keep the wings level. The electromagnetic chaos was different now, too. Without the central thrumming, other sounds bled through the static. Whispers, faint, sibilant, voices that seemed to slither into her helmet, speaking a language that sounded like cracking ice. They were echoes of the creatures, the psychic residue of their presence. They spoke of dying stars and silent, empty worlds. They were voices of absolute despair, and they were trying to get inside her head, to break her will. She clenched her jaw, focusing on the image of the airstrip, a single point of stability in a universe of madness. Back at the 77th's home base, Master Sergeant Vance stood alone in the command center, staring at a blank radar screen. Commander Thorne had officially declared Rios a WOL and her aircraft lost. A recovery mission would be launched once the storm abates, but Vance knew. He was monitoring a single, obscure frequency, a back-channel comms link built into the jet's black box, a system he had designed himself. It was broadcasting a faint, intermittent signal, a heartbeat. He couldn't hear her, can't track her, but he knew the jet's core systems were still, somehow, online. The mood among the other pilots had changed. The mockery was gone, replaced by a tense, uncomfortable silence. They had heard the comms from FOB Peregrine. They had heard the cheers. They heard Diaz call her Valkyrie. They saw the satellite imagery, which now showed the storm cell inexplicably dissipating at a rate that defied all meteorological models. They looked at Commander Thorne, who stood rigidly by the main screen, his face a mask of anger and denial. They were starting to realize that Rios wasn't being reckless. She was being right. In the cockpit, a sheet of ice spiders across the inside of the canopy as the temperature plummeted in a sudden downdraft. The whispers were getting louder. She fought back with memories of her own. The smell of coffee in Vance's workshop, the warmth of the sun on the flight line, the faces of every pilot she's ever saved. She was not just a weapon, she was a guardian, and guardians do not fall. With a final, desperate surge of power, she broke through the outer edge of the storm and into clear, blessedly quiet air. The sun was setting, painting the clouds below in hues of orange and gold, but her relief was short-lived. The engine coughed, sputtered, and died. The silence in the cockpit was now absolute. The death of the engine was a final, profound stillness. The only sound was the rush of wind over the canopy. The F-16 was no longer an aircraft. It was a 15-ton glider, and it was falling. Below her, the jagged peaks of the Zagros Mountains were cast in the long shadows of twilight. A beautiful but unforgiving landscape. She had altitude, maybe 30,000 feet, but it was bleeding away with every second. The airstrip at Sheol Pass was still miles away. Panic was a luxury she could not afford. Her training, her entire life, had been about managing chaos, about finding a solution when there is none. She immediately began the engine restart sequence, her hands moving with practiced efficiency over the control panels. Ignition, fuel flow, nothing. She tried again. The engine was dead. The blast must have damaged the fuel lines beyond repair. Ejection was an option, but it was a poor one. The terrain below was unsurvivable, and she would be abandoning her jet, her old warrior. There was another way, a death. Landing in a fighter jet is one of the most difficult maneuvers a pilot can perform. It's a controlled crash, an exercise in energy management that requires absolute precision. Most pilots will only ever do it in a simulator. Rios had done it, for real, once before, in a place she couldn't talk about. She pushed the jet's nose down to maintain airspeed, trading altitude for velocity. She had to make the glide last as long as possible. The Viper became a different kind of animal now, graceful and silent, its wings carving through the thin mountain air. At the home base, Vance saw the signal from the black box change. The data stream indicating engine function had flatlined, but the flight control data was still active. He knew exactly what she was doing. He ran to a communications console. Pushing past a bewildered officer, he patched into the frequency for FOB Peregrine. Sergeant Diaz, this is Master Sergeant Vance of the 77th. I need your help. Do you have any assets that can move? Diaz, his voice still buzzing with adrenaline, replied, we have a couple of old Humvees that still run. Why? Because Captain Rios is falling out of the sky, Vance said, his voice grim, and she's heading for Sheol Pass. She's going to try and land it. She'll need pickup now. Through the canopy, Rios could see it, a thin dark line against the grey rock, almost invisible in the fading light. The airstrip, it was shorter than she remembered, and it was littered with debris. She had only one shot. She couldn't go around. She couldn't add power. She had to hit the threshold perfectly. She lowered the landing gear without engine power. She had to use the emergency nitrogen bottle to force them down. They locked into place with a reassuring thud. She was committed. The ground rushed up to meet her. On the ground, Sergeant Diaz didn't hesitate. He grabbed a handful of his best soldiers and piled them into two battered Humvees. Sheol Pass now, he yelled to the driver. The abandoned airstrip was in a contested valley, a place where local warlords and insurgent groups operated freely. Going out there, especially at night, was a suicide mission, but not a single soldier questioned the order. The pilot of the F-16, the Valkyrie, had descended from a mythical storm to save them. Now, they would drive into the jaws of hell to return the favor. The Humvees tore out of the FOB's gate, their headlights cutting feeble paths into the encroaching darkness. The F-16 was a ghost in the twilight, with no engine noise. Its approach to the runway was eerily silent. A lone goat herder on a nearby ridge looked up, his eyes wide with disbelief at the sight of the winged shape gliding silently out of the sky. Rios was utterly focused on her airspeed indicator and the end of the runway. Too fast, and she'd overshoot into the rocks. Too slow, and she'd stall and drop like a stone. The margin for error was less than 5 knots. The wheels touched the asphalt. The impact was hard, a jarring shock that rattled every bone in her body. The jet was still moving at over 150 miles per hour. She deployed the drag chute, which blossomed behind the aircraft, a splash of white against the gray dusk. It wasn't enough. The runway was too short. She stood on the brakes, the tires screaming in protest, leaving black streaks on the cracked pavement. The end of the runway, and a sheer drop-off into a canyon, was rushing towards her. The jet slewed sideways, the left landing gear collapsing under the strain. The wingtips scraped the ground, sending up a shower of sparks. The nose gear gave way, and the front of the F-16 dug into the asphalt, gouging a deep trench. The jet ground to a halt, twisted and broken, less than 10 feet from the edge of the canyon. The silence that followed was absolute, broken only by the ticking of cooling metal. For a long moment, there was no movement. Then, the canopy slowly opened with a hydraulic hiss. Captain Kaylin Rios, bruised, exhausted, but alive, unstrapped herself and climbed out of the cockpit. She stood on the broken wing of her aircraft and looked back at the path of destruction. She laid a hand on the fuselage, a gesture of farewell to her faithful warrior. In the distance, she saw the faint pinpricks of headlights approaching. Diaz and his men. She pulled her service pistol from her vest, not out of fear, but out of habit. In the Zagros Mountains, the quiet never lasts for long. The Humvees skidded to a halt 100 yards from the wrecked F-16. The soldiers piled out, weapons at the ready, scanning the surrounding ridges. Diaz approached the pilot cautiously. In the beams of the headlights, he saw her for the first time, a lone figure, not particularly tall or imposing, standing on the wing of a dead fighter jet. Her face was smudged with grease and sweat, but her eyes were clear and steady. "Captain Rios?" Diaz asked, his voice filled with a mixture of awe and respect. She nodded, holstering her pistol. "Call me Kaylin or Valkyrie. I guess you've earned it." A slow grin spread across Diaz's face. "Sergeant Diaz, my men and I owe you our lives." He looked at the F-16, a mangled wreck that somehow flew through an impossible storm and landed without power. How Rios slid off the wing, her boots crunching on the broken asphalt. "She's a stubborn old bird." One of the younger soldiers, a private, pointed towards the jet's cockpit. "Ma'am, what's that symbol?" He was pointing at the small, hand-painted Valkyrie shield on the canopy rail. Rios looked at it, a flicker of old pain and pride in her eyes. "It's a squadron insignia," she said, the words tasting like a lie. From a long time ago, it wasn't a lie, not entirely. It was the unofficial symbol of a unit that didn't exist, a unit of pilots sent into situations that were officially impossible. They were called the Einherjar, and she was the last of them. A sharp crack echoed through the valley. A bullet ricocheted off the F-16's fuselage with a loud ping. "Contact," a soldier yelled. Muzzle flashes erupted from the ridges overlooking the airstrip. They'd been spotted. Warlords, insurgents, it didn't matter. They saw a downed American pilot and a squad of soldiers, an easy prize. Rios didn't flinch. She pulled her M4 rifle from its cockpit holster, her movements fluid and economical. "Diaz, get your men into a defensive perimeter. Use the wreck for cover. What's your ammo situation?" Diaz was momentarily stunned by her immediate command presence. She wasn't just a pilot, she was a warrior. "Well, oh ma'am, we used most of it at the FOB." "Then make every shot count," she said, her voice cold and hard. She took a position behind the broken landing gear, the metal still warm from the landing. The sky had saved them once, now they had to survive the ground. The quiet of Sheol Pass was shattered by the thunder of a firefight. The firefight was brutal and one-sided. Diaz's small squad and Rios were heavily outnumbered. The enemy held the high ground, pouring fire down onto the exposed airstrip. Bullets sparked and whined off the F-16's wreckage, which provided their only substantial cover. The soldiers, exhausted from their earlier battle at the FOB, were running on pure adrenaline. Rios was the calm center of the storm. Her years of survival training in hostile territories took over. She moved between positions, directing fire, conserving ammunition, and keeping the soldiers' morale from collapsing. Her shots were precise, aimed, and deadly. She wasn't just spraying and praying, she was picking targets, forcing the enemy to keep their heads down. The soldiers watched her, their confidence growing. This pilot, this Valkyrie, was more than they could have imagined. She fought with the cold efficiency of a seasoned infantry veteran. During a lull in the fighting, as they reloaded magazines in the dark, Diaz crawled over to her position. "Where did you learn to fight like that, Captain?" he asked, his voice low. Rios stared out into the darkness, her eyes scanning the ridges. "Some places, the only way out is on foot." A memory flashed, a burning jungle, the wreckage of a different aircraft. and a long, bloody walk back to friendly lines. She was younger then, barely a lieutenant. That was the first time she'd been shot down. It wasn't the last. Her call sign wasn't just about saving others. It was about her own uncanny ability to survive battles no one else could. Back at base, Commander Thorne was facing a mutiny. Master Sergeant Vance, armed with the comms logs from FOB Peregrine and the black box, data showing Rios's dead stick landing, had presented the evidence to the squadron's executive officer. The other pilots of the 77th, the ones who had mocked her, now stood behind Vance. They knew Rios was alive, on the ground, and in trouble. Thorne refused to act. She disobeyed a direct order. She stole a billion-dollar asset and crashed it. I will not risk more lives and aircraft for one reckless pilot. A young F-35 pilot, call sign Dice, stepped forward. Sir, our squadron is called the Gamblers. We're supposed to take risks when the stakes are high. 34 men are alive because she took a risk we were afraid to. If we leave her out there, we're not gamblers, we're just cowards. The sentiment echoed through the room. Thorne looked at the faces of his pilots, and for the first time, he saw that he had lost them. His authority had shattered against the undeniable truth of Rios's heroism. The enemy on the ridges was getting bolder, creeping closer under the cover of darkness. They had RPGs. A rocket-propelled grenade screamed out of the night and exploded against the F-16's tail, showering the defenders with shrapnel. The situation was becoming untenable. They couldn't hold out until morning. Rios looked at the wrecked jet. It was a dead machine, but it was not entirely useless. Diaz, she said, her mind racing. Give me cover. I need to get back into the cockpit. Diaz looked at her like she was insane. Ma'am, the plane is a wreck. The plane is a wreck, she agreed, but the battery might still have some juice, and the cannon has its own independent firing system. A wild, desperate plan was forming. In her mind, under a hail of covering fire from Diaz and his men, Rios sprinted across the open ground and scrambled back into the cockpit of the F-16. The inside was a mess of broken glass and dangling wires. She ignored the damage, her hands flying across the panels, flipping switches from memory. She needed to bypass dozens of safety lockouts and reroute power from the emergency battery directly to the gun's firing mechanism. It was a procedure that didn't exist in any manual, a trick taught to her by Vance for a what-if scenario they never thought would actually happen. At the home base, Vance overrode Thorne's authority. Using his master sergeant's stripes and the sheer force of his personality, he began organizing a rescue mission. He knew he'd be court-martialed, but he didn't care. He pulled Dice and another pilot aside. You're not going in blind. The storm is gone, but the valley is crawling with hostiles. You'll provide top cover. A low helicopter will go in for the extraction, but they need the ground cleared first. He looked at the tactical map. Sheol Pass is a death trap. In the cockpit, Rios found the right combination. A single light flickered on the armaments panel. Power it wasn't much, but it might be enough. She couldn't aim the jet, which was canted at a sharp angle, its nose buried in the asphalt, but the cannon was pointing roughly towards the main enemy position on the northern ridge. She armed the gun. A low hum filled the cockpit as the weapon's hydraulic motors spun up. On the ground, Diaz and his men heard the sound and stared in disbelief. The dead beast was waking up. Rios took a breath, put her thumb on the trigger, and prepared to turn her downed fighter jet into the world's biggest, most expensive fixed gun emplacement. The effect of the cannon was apocalyptic. The M61 Vulcan, even when fired from a stationary, broken platform, was a weapon of terrifying power. A stream of 20mm shells, each one explosive, ripped through the night, tearing a fiery line across the northern ridge. The sound was deafening, a continuous soul-shaking roar that echoed through the valley. Trees were shredded, rocks were pulverized, and the enemy position simply vanished in a series of explosive impacts. The surviving attackers were stunned into silence. They were fighting a small, trapped squad of soldiers. They were not prepared to fight a grounded F-16. The sheer overwhelming violence of the cannon broke their will to fight. They panicked, firing wildly before melting back into the darkness, abandoning the siege. In the sudden, ringing silence, Diaz and his men could only stare at the burning ridge. The air was thick with the smell of cordite and ozone. Rio slumped back in her cockpit seat, the last of the battery's power expended. The jet was truly dead now. She had played her final card. She transmitted on her emergency radio, a small handheld device. Valkyrie to any friendly forces. Sheol Pass is quiet for now, but we are exposed and out of ammunition. Her call was answered almost immediately. Valkyrie, this is Gambler Flight. Lead by Dice. Wear your top cover. We have you in sight. Rios looked up. High above she saw the navigation lights of two F-35s circling like guardian angels. A moment later she heard the distinctive thumping of rotor blades. A Pave-Low helicopter, bristling with guns, was descending towards the airstrip, its searchlight cutting a brilliant cone through the darkness. The cavalry had arrived. On board the lead F-35, Dice looked at his thermal imaging display. He saw the wrecked F-16, the small cluster of soldiers, and the devastation on the ridge. He keyed his mic, broadcasting on the command channel, knowing full well that Commander Thorne was listening. Command, be advised. Valkyrie has secured the LZ. I say again, the landing zone is secure. She took on an entire company of hostiles. With a dead jet and one, the message was clear. The story of what happened here tonight was not going to be buried. The legend of Valkyrie was just beginning. The Pave-Low landed with a gust of wind that sent dust and debris swirling across the airstrip. Pararescue jumpers, the legendary PJs, spilled out, securing the perimeter and tending to the wounded soldiers. Rios climbed down from the cockpit for the last time and was met by the helicopter's flight lead. He looked from her to the wrecked jet, then to the burning ridge, and just shook his head in disbelief. Captain Rios, he said, his voice full of respect, we've been told to extend to you a personal invitation from the General. He wants a word. The flight back to base was quiet. The wounded were stabilized, and the exhausted soldiers slept. Rios sat by the open door of the helicopter, the wind whipping at her hair, watching the dark mountains slide by below. She felt a profound sense of emptiness. She had saved the men at the FOB. She had survived the crash. She had won the firefight. But her jet, her partner for so many years, lay broken and abandoned in a forgotten valley. It felt like she had lost a part of herself. When the Pave-Low touched down at the home base, they were not greeted by armed guards and a court-martial. The entire 77th Squadron was on the flight line, along with Master Sergeant Vance. As Rios stepped off the ramp, they didn't salute. They began to applaud, a slow, steady clap that grew in volume. The pilots who had mocked her, the ones who had called her a relic, now looked at her with unadulterated awe. Dice was the first to approach. That was the craziest damn piece of flying I've ever heard of, he said, a wide grin on his face. It's an honor to fly with you, ma'am. Vance was the last to greet her. He walked up, his face as gruff as ever, but his eyes told a different story. He looked her over, checking for injuries. You scratched the paint, he said, his voice a low grumble. Rios managed a weak smile. Sorry, Chief. Vance clapped a heavy hand on her shoulder. Jets can be replaced. Pilots like you can't. It was the highest praise he could possibly give. Commander Thorne was conspicuously absent. He had been quietly and unceremoniously relieved of command pending an inquiry. His refusal to act, his failure to trust his pilot, had ended his career. The system, for once, had recognized that true leadership isn't about following orders, it's about making the right call when lives are on the line. The story of the pilot who flew into the heart of a supernatural storm, who fought monsters from another world, and who held off an army with a dead jet, was already spreading like wildfire. The official debrief was a surreal experience. Rios sat in a sterile conference room, facing a 2-star general flown in specifically for this purpose. She told him everything, holding nothing back. The unnatural storm, the crystalline structures, the creatures that dissolved into dust. She expected to be dismissed, to be sent for a psychiatric evaluation. Instead, the general just listened, his face impassive. When she was finished, he slid a folder across the table. It was stamped with a classification level she had never seen before. Inside were grainy satellite photos, redacted reports, and eyewitness sketches from other unexplained events around the world. A missing submarine in the Pacific, a research outpost in Antarctica that went silent, all linked by reports of strange energy readings and impossible phenomena. You're not the first to encounter them, Captain, the general said, his voice grave, but you are the first to fight them and walk away. He pointed to a sketch in the file. It was a drawing of a symbol found carved into the wall of a lost temple in the Amazon. It was the winged shield of the Valkyrie, your old unit, the one that never existed. They were created to be the first line of defense against this threat. They were the ones who understood that not all battles are fought against men. He explained that the program was dismantled due to politics and disbelief, its members scattered, its knowledge buried. Her mentor, the man who had trained her, was the program's last commander. He had died trying to convince his superiors that the threat was real. Captain Rios, the general said, closing the folder. What happened at FOB Peregrine is being classified at the highest level. The official story will be that you flew through a severe storm to rescue trapped soldiers. Your actions were heroic, and you will be decorated for them. Your F-16 was lost due to weather damage. He leaned forward, but unofficially. We're reactivating the program, and we need someone to lead it. Someone who has faced the enemy and survived. Someone who carries the legacy. Rios looked down at her hands. All her life she had been an outsider, a ghost in the machine, fighting secret wars and carrying a burden of knowledge she could never share. She had been underestimated, mocked, and sidelined. Now she was being offered a chance to step out of the shadows, not just as a pilot, but as a commander in a war for the very survival of their world. The choice was hers. She could accept the medals, take a quiet desk job, and let the world forget. Or she could embrace her call sign, her legacy, and become the shield the world didn't even know it needed. Weeks later, Kalen Rios, now promoted to major, stood in a hangar at a remote, undisclosed airbase. It was a place that didn't appear on any map. In front of her was a new squadron, handpicked by her from the best and brightest stand, the most unconventional pilots the Air Force had to offer. Dice was there, his cocky grin firmly in place. A few other pilots from the 77th who had proven their mettle were present. There were also new faces, a quiet, intense pilot who specialized in electronic warfare, a former test pilot who could fly anything with wings, and others with unique unregulation skills. In the center of the hangar sat her new aircraft. It was an F-16, but like none other. It was a brand new, experimental F-16V Block 70 seconds, the most advanced version ever built. But it had been further modified, stripped of vulnerabilities, and hardened with the same kind of secret technology that Vance had put into her old jet. Its paint was a matte, non-reflective black. On its tail there was no squadron number, only a single stark white symbol, the winged shield of the Valkyrie. This was the first jet of the new Einherjar. Master Sergeant Elias Vance walked out of the shadows, a datapad in his hand. He wasn't going to let his pilot go into this new war without her crew chief. He was now the lead engineer for the entire program. "She's ready, Major," he said, a rare smile touching his lips. "We've named her. Tail number 870362, same as the old girl we're calling her Phoenix." Rios addressed her new pilots. Her voice was quiet but carried the weight of authority and experience. "Look around you," she said. "You've all been chosen because you're the best. But your skills are going to be tested in ways you can't imagine. We are not just pilots anymore. We are guardians. We are the ones who fly into the storms no one else can. We are the shield against the darkness." The official name of this unit is the 99th Special Operations Squadron. But to each other, and to those we save, we have another name. She pointed to the symbol on the jet's tail. "We are the Valkyries, and our mission is to ensure that when our warriors call for help from the battlefield, we are the ones who answer." A new sense of purpose settled over the assembled pilots. They were no longer just soldiers. They were part of a legend, a legacy. Reborn from the fire and thunder of a battle in a forgotten mountain range, the mockery was gone, replaced by a fierce, unshakable respect. The underestimated pilot had become the leader of heroes, and her call sign was now their battle cry. Past, the 99th trained in secret, pushing their new aircraft and themselves to the absolute limit. They learned to fly in total electronic silence, to navigate by the stars, to fight not just enemy aircraft, but the very environment itself. Rios molded them into a cohesive unit, a family bound by a shared, secret purpose. The legend of what happened in the Zagros Mountains became their founding myth, a story told in hushed tones, a reminder of the stakes. The General's secret task force fed them intelligence. The strange events were increasing in frequency. A fishing trawler found adrift in the North Atlantic, its crew gone, its electronics fused, and its hull covered in a strange crystalline residue. A seismic event in the Gobi Desert that registered on no geological sensor, but was accompanied by a localized, violent sandstorm that appeared and vanished in under an hour. The enemy was testing, probing, their incursions becoming more frequent, more bold. The call came on a cold Tuesday morning. A deep space monitoring station, built on a remote volcanic island in the Pacific, had gone silent. The island was currently being battered by a typhoon of unprecedented strength, a storm that had formed in a matter of hours, defying all weather models. The last transmission from the station was a single, panicked sentence: "The sky is opening up." Rios stood before the tactical display, the satellite image of the Pacific typhoon swirling on the screen. It had the same unnatural, perfectly circular structure she remembered. the same concentrated energy readings at its core. It was happening. Again, she turned to her pilots, who were already suiting up. There was no fear in their eyes, only a grim determination. "You know the mission," she said. "We go in, we assess the threat, and we protect our people. Dice, you're on my wing. Vance, you're our eyes and ears from here." As she walked towards her new F-16, the Phoenix, she felt a sense of calm descend upon her. This was her purpose. The storm, the silence, the sky, they were no longer just elements, they were the battlefield. Her call sign was no longer just a name, it was a promise. She strapped into the cockpit, the familiar feel of the controls, a comfort. She looked at the winged shield painted on the canopy rail. She was not just Kalen Rios anymore. She was Valkyrie 1, leader of the new Inhaga. The canopy closed, and the engine roared to life. With her squadron forming up behind her, she taxied onto the runway, turned the nose of her jet towards the horizon, and led her Valkyries into the heart of another impossible storm. The Legacy was now in motion. The Pacific storm was larger and more violent than the one in the Zargos. The sky was a churning vortex of black and electric blue. But this time Rios was not alone. Her squadron flew in perfect formation, a wedge of black ghosts against the maelstrom. Their hardened jets sliced through the turbulence that would have torn a normal aircraft apart. Their comms were silent, linked by a quantum-entangled data system that was impervious to the storm's interference. They were a single, cohesive weapon. They broke through into the eye of the storm. Below them, the volcanic island was transformed. The Deep Space Observatory was shattered, and at the center of the caldera, a shimmering, vertical tear in reality hung in the air. It was a gateway, a wound in the fabric of spacetime, and from it, the same thin, distorted figures were emerging, not in dozens, but in hundreds. They were not just dismantling the station, they were assembling something, a massive crystalline spire that pulsed with an energy that made the air crackle. "Valkyrie 1 to all units," Rios's voice was calm and clear in their helmets. "Target the spire, do not let them complete it. Weapons free." The squadron broke formation, diving towards the island. The enemy responded instantly. The air itself became a weapon, but the Valkyries were prepared. They weaved and dodged the pockets of distorted space. Their movements a deadly, choreographed ballet. This time, the enemy on the ground was not their only problem. Smaller, faster, winged versions of the creatures detached from the portal and rose to meet them, outriders, fighters. A dogfight began in the eye of a supernatural hurricane. A battle for a world that doesn't know it's at war. Rios engaged two of the alien fighters, her Phoenix moving with a lethal grace. She was no longer just a survivor. She was a predator. She saw not just targets, but patterns, weaknesses. She felt the flow of the battle, the intent of her enemy, listening to the story the sky was telling her. With a perfectly executed maneuver, she got on their tails and stitched them both with her cannon. They dissolved into nothingness. Below, Dice and the others were unleashing a volley of specialized missiles, designed by Vance, that shattered the crystalline spire. As the spire collapsed, the portal destabilized, flickering violently. The remaining creatures were pulled back into the void, their silent screams echoing in the psychic ether. The storm began to break apart, the unnatural energy dissipating. The sun broke through the clouds. Rios formed her squadron up. They were all there. They were all alive. She looked out at the vast, now peaceful expanse of the Pacific. This is her life now, flying on the edge of reality, the quiet guardian against the storm. The story of the underestimated pilot is over. The story of the Valkyrie, the shield of humanity, the legend whispered among those who know, has just begun.